So our structure, what we'll do is first, we'll spend the first section of our shiur talking on a halachic level about a particular topic. And then I want to try to take it to the next level and see how does the halakha impact our understanding of what it means to be a mourner, what it means to be an avel, what it means to be a member of Am Yisrael, and why it is that we mourn so deeply on this day. And I'm going to explore that idea through a halachic topic. Putting on tefillin, I'm sorry, I know as we have women here, don't to be discouraged. You can learn a lot with this as well, even though maybe you don't put on tefillin every day. But the topic of putting on tefillin or not putting on tefillin, when a person is an avel, when a person is a mourner. So we're going to explore first the halachic sources and then see how this can have an impact on our mindset about mourning. And I think everybody hopefully will be able to take away some kind of a lesson from this. So if you see on the first source of your page, there's a Gemara in Masechet Moed Katan, where all of the laws of mourning are found. Oddly enough, Moed Katan means, anybody, what does Moed Katan mean? Small holiday, what are we referring to? Chol HaMoed, very good, Jerry, right? So the Masechet that deals with Chol HaMoed is also the Masechet that deals with mourning, with Avelut, which seems to be a very strange dynamic. You rarely expect to find the laws of mourning coupled together with the laws of Chol HaMoed, of a holiday. But it's very interesting that many of the same laws that apply to how we navigate Chol HaMoed, like doing work and writing and other things, happen to actually find parallels in the laws of Avelut. And I can't go into that in so much depth, but it's just an interesting concept that we often find parallels between very happy sides of things and very sad sides of things. Very interestingly enough, the concept of 7-day mourning period does not come from the Torah. It's established by Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu established 2 7-day periods parallel to each other. Does anybody know what those 2 7-day periods are? I gave you the 7-day period of mourning. Another 7-day period? Not Nidah, that's from the Torah. No, Shiva is the mourning period, but there's another time period of 7 days. Think the exact opposite of Avelut. Very? Sheva B'Achot, 7 days of marriage, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu actually saw a very important need for people to be able to process the very, very high and also the very, very low. How do you come off of getting married, this momentous occasion, life-changing happiness? You need 7 days to process it. Someone loses a relative, their world has been turned upside down, 7 days to process it. Moshe Rabbeinu understood the extremes of a person's emotion and mental state and established these two things parallel to each other. So we often find extreme happiness and its laws mirroring extreme sadness and its laws, which is very interesting. You can probably do a lot more on that. But the very first source, Moed Katan Tetvav Amud Aleph, reads the following: Avel asur lehaniach tefillin. Someone who is in mourning is not permitted to don tefillin. How do we know? When the prophet Yehezkel lost his wife and went into mourning, Hashem came to Yehezkel and gave him a particular directive: make sure you put on your pe'ercha, your glory, havosh alecha. Make sure you wear it upon you. This, our rabbis understand, was God's way of telling Yehezkel, you must put on your tefillin, despite the fact that you are in mourning for your wife. Mikelal, from here the Gemara says we can infer, if Hashem had to come to Yehezkel during this time of mourning and tell him, make sure you put on your tefillin, what does that mean for the rest of us? The status quo is no tefillin. Unless God tells you, you don't put on tefillin. So Mikelal, from here we can infer that the rest of us, they should never know, but if ever have to experience mourning, do not put on our tefillin. If you skip down to the bottom of the page in source 3, this idea is echoed in a Gemara in Masechet Sukkah, Daf Kafeh Amud Bet, which expands upon this concept a little bit more. Amar BeAb, אמר BeAb בר זבדה אמר רב, אבל חייב בכל מצוות האמורות בתורה. A mourner is obligated to perform all mitzvot that are mentioned in the Torah. They're not exempt from anything, chutz, with the exception of tefillin. That's the only mitzvah they're not permitted to perform. Shehare ne'emar bahem pe'er, because tefillin are called our glory. Umidika'amar ne'rachmana liYechezkel pe'ercha harosh alecha, from the fact that Hashem told Yechezkel, wear your glory, your tefillin, at hu demechayvat, you are obligated, aval kule alma petire, but everyone else is exempt. The Gemara here teaches us one more important halachic point, that this only applies b'yom rishon, on the first day of a person's 7-day mourning period. Dichtiv, as the pasuk says, ve'acharita ki yom mar. The day shall be, in the end, therefore, as a bitter day. Notice the word day is singular. So the rabbis take that idea and say only the first day, when a person is most raw and most intense when it comes to his grieving, his or her grieving, is tefillin not an appropriate time for that mitzvah. But all the other remaining days of avelut, a person is, as an avel, obligated to put on tefillin. So halakha l'maaseh, a mourner on the day that he buries his relative on that first day is exempt from putting on tefillin, and accordingly also prohibited from even putting on tefillin. The remaining days 2 to 7, obligated to go ahead and put on tefillin. Questions? Comments? Okay, very good. Can anybody think, aside from the Gemara telling us about the pasuk in Yechezkel, so far we've learned about the pasuk, why else, logically or philosophically, would the halakha exempt a person who's a mourner from tefillin? Leaving the directive of Yechezkel, why is tefillin exempt, not a mitzvah that Avel can perform? He's obligated to perform 612 mitzvah. All the other mitzvah he's obligated in, just tefillin he can't do. Okay?
Kavanah.
Kavanah. What do you mean by kavanah?
Well, we're supposed to, I don't think we all do it, but when we have tefillin on, we should be having a certain kavanah with Hashem, of our prayer.
Excellent. So, when a person, right, when a person puts on their tefillin in the morning, tefillin requires a very intense level of concentration. A person has to know that they are wearing the name of Hashem on their arm and on their head. Once upon a time, they used to wear tefillin all day long. But nowadays, because we fear that we cannot properly respect the tefillin on us all day long, we have so many other things distracting us throughout our day, so many other things going on. Cleanliness also of our body becomes an issue throughout the day. So because we have all of these issues, we relegate ourselves to just putting on tefillin for, depending on what day it is, 30 to 40 minutes a day, depending on minyan, you also pray it as well. You get 20 to 30 minutes a day, something like that, right? And even that 30 minutes, 40 minutes, people will tell you is a very, very big challenge to maintain focus and concentration, to not look at their phone, to not talk to their person next to them about the game last night, to be totally involved in the mitzvah of tefillin for 40 minutes without distraction is very, very challenging for us. So it makes a lot of sense that it might be difficult for a person who's going through a major tragedy, like losing a relative. They've just come from the cemetery and buried their relative. They're not in a frame of mind, they're not in a head to be able to put on tefillin and to properly focus on the holiness and sanctity of Hashem's name on their head and on their arm, that it would make sense for us to go ahead and to accept them. So kavanah is in fact one of the ideas, but theoretically, then it should make a difference if it's the first day or the other 6 days. If a person says on day 3, I'm still, in a wreck, in shambles over the loss of my whatever, then they should still be exempt from putting on tefillin. And it happens to be, by the way, the halakha does say that during the times of eulogies and crying, a person should not put on their tefillin because they won't be able to have concentration. So concentration is a big part of it, but I sense that there might be something even deeper than that lying beneath the surface as to why the rabbis would not want a mourner in that day, in that intensity, to put on their tefillin. Any other thoughts? Possibilities? Okay, so that's maybe a goal we're trying to work towards to answer that question. Which might be making sure we're on the time frame. Okay, very good. So there is a halachic question: at what point on day 2 you can go ahead and start putting on tefillin? I'm not going to go so intense onto that, but if you look at page 2, source 6, you'll see 6 and 7 tells us very clearly that what we've learned already is halacha l'maaseh. This comes from the Shulchan Aruch. I always like to just read from the Shulchan Aruch because that's our code book of law. Avel b'yom rishon asur lahaniach tefillin. A mourner on the first day of mourning is prohibited from wearing tefillin. Mikan va'elach, beyond the first day, chayav. They are obligated. Afilu ba'u panim hadashot. I want to spend a moment just on that. Even if panim hadashot are. Anybody know what panim hadashot are? New visitors. Anybody? Where have you heard that term panim hadashot before? Say it. Right? So the concept of panim hadashot is if a new person who has not consoled the mourner, who has not been around the mourner since the time that they experienced their tragedy, comes to visit somebody, all of a sudden the emotions are stirred up in the person again. If anybody's ever had to go through such a tragedy, all of a sudden you see a cousin walk in that you never saw, or an aunt or an uncle that walk in that you haven't seen since you found out the news. All of a sudden you break down and you start crying and you give them a big hug because seeing that new face who you've not seen since you found out about this tragedy can stir up all of those emotions. So the Shulchan Aruch says, interestingly enough, he has to take the time out to say that even if a new person comes to the house of mourning to visit, the person is still obligated to put on their tefillin. There may have been a possible thought that when a new person comes and the tragedy is stirred up again, maybe you should have to remove your tefillin. The answer is no, you don't have to. But I like this halacha because typically most of us only contemplate the idea of panim chadashot when it comes to sheva berachot. That at every sheva berachot you have to have panim chadashot. You have to have new people that came, that weren't at the wedding, that weren't under the chuppah, that hadn't heard sheva berachot. And when you have new people who come in, the happiness is excited again. You can only make sheva berachot if you have some people who haven't experienced it yet. If it's the same people for all 6 days, by the time you get to the end of it, all right, how much of a happiness is it already, right? For the Hatan and Kala, Sheva Kiralot, for them, they got to go around everywhere for the whole entire time. They can't get a week of sleep, right? It's an exhausting experience, right, for anybody who remembers it. The old timers say they were much happier when they got to go on their honeymoon the second the wedding was over. We've done away with that for different reasons. But in any case, you see panim hadashot, these same concepts that you find by happiness, by marriage, you find also in the case of deep sadness when it comes to mourning. The last one, source 7 on page 2. Avel asur lahaniach tefillin b'yom rishon. Again, that first day. Ve'achar shehanetzach hama. After the sun has risen, b'yom sheni, on the second day, mutar lahanicham. Then it's permissible to go ahead and to put them on. Okay. A simple question that we'll answer outside is, how is it that the rabbis are able, or the halacha is able to tell a person not to put on tefillin on a day simply because they're in mourning? How can they undermine a mitzvah from the Torah when avelut, for the most part, is viewed as what? What level mitzvah is avelut? It's d'Rabbanan, as I told you. It doesn't come from the Torah. We don't have any source explicitly in the Torah that tells us that a person has to go ahead and mourn. There are some hints to it, that when Yosef buried his father Yaakov, he did a 7-day mourning period. But the rabbis say that was before the Torah was given. You can't learn from that. There's also some mourning aspects when it came to Aharon and his children, but nothing 100% clear. There's no directive explicitly in the Torah that talks about mourning. Most rabbis consider the practice of mourning to be an institution of Moshe Rabbeinu, which still holds the level of D'Rabbanan. So how can this mitzvah of avelut, which is D'Rabbanan, in fact bump off the mitzvah from the Torah that everybody has to put on tefillin every single day? And we see it doesn't bump any other mitzvah, it only bumps this one. Ralph, you have a thought? Like the mourning experience itself. Yeah, there's an interesting concept that we say Yishem, we don't say tahanunim, we don't say supplications on a mourning day for different reasons. But I don't think that would be strong enough to bump off a mitzvah from the Torah, like the mitzvah of tefillin. So you want to say that actually not putting on tefillin is not negating the mitzvah, it's actually fulfilling the mitzvah, because you're keeping to the idea that you shouldn't put on tefillin if in fact it's not appropriate to do so. And in fact, there are some commentaries who say that if a mourner, notice how it's prohibited for a mourner to put on tefillin. It's not he's exempt, but if he wants to, he can. No, it's forbidden. He's not allowed. And many commentaries do bring that idea down that if the mourner did put on tefillin, he would be disgracing the tefillin. It would be a bizayon to the tefillin for him to put it on in that situation. So you can argue that not putting on tefillin is the kiyum potentially as well. One other technical answer, speak up, you said.
Based on that concept, they're on a higher level, kind of like Chol Hamoed, so they don't need to put tefillin on.
So maybe an Avel is going through such an out-of-body experience, such a high-level experience, that maybe they don't need that in order to be able to climb. It's an interesting thought. I wonder, how if we surveyed, 100 people during their time of mourning, if they felt that way. Do they feel closer to Hashem? I think you'd get a lot of people who say they feel farther from Hashem when their time of mourning is. So I would hesitate to play around with that idea, only because it's hard to make a blanket statement that people who are in mourning feel closer to Hashem. You can make a very strong case the exact opposite, that people who are in mourning probably feel very distant from Hashem. In fact, the reason why we say things like tziduk hadin, like we give people prayer of the judgment, or the reason why I believe Kaddish was instituted for people who are in mourning, is because people who are in mourning often question God during that experience. God, why have you done this to me? In fact, if you had to pick one word to represent the day of Tish'a BeAb, what word would you probably pick? It's the name of the book that we read. Echa. I would probably read Echa. The word Echa is everywhere when you think about Tish'a BeAb, and Echa means, how did this happen? Mourners feel, how did this happen? Why did this happen? How did this happen to me? And for what? For what purpose? Mourners, people who go through devastating experiences in their lives, have a lot of philosophical questions. It's for that very basic reason that the Rabbi said the mourner has to say Kaddish. Because what does Kaddish say? Yeheh Shemeh Rabbi Mevarach. The name of Hashem should be blessed. The mourner who has the most questions, who has the most claims against God, who has the right, perhaps even at that moment, to say to Hashem, how could you do this to me? He's the one who has to say, Hashem's name will be blessed. We put it in his mouth, and we make him say, Baruch Nayat HaEmet, blessed is the true judge. We make him say time and again, I accept the judgment of Hashem. What Hashem does is truthful. I may not understand it, but I accept whatever Hashem goes ahead and does. So my sense is that mourners probably feel very distant, and we do things to kind of push them a little bit forward. But it's an interesting thing to maybe contemplate a little bit more. On a halachic level, our rabbis teach us, this is the Psak Halacha, so you should know, that it is in fact a deoraita, a Torah commandment, to observe mourning only once, one day. If the day of the passing of the relative and the day of the burial occurs on the same day, then many, like the Rabbi you can see in front of you on page 3, source 8, the Rabbi you can see in the golden letters, this is his first halacha of his laws of Avel. He writes, Ve'en avelut min ha-Torah, there's no mourning from the Torah, ela beyom rishon bilvad, except on the first day, shehu yom ha-mita ve'yom ha-kivra. If that's the day that the person passed and was buried simultaneously. About she'ar ha-shivat yamin, the remaining 7 days, or the day of burial that does not coincide with the day of passing, which can happen a lot, especially here in America where we don't bury at night. So oftentimes when a person passes away late in the day, they won't be buried till the following morning, which means their passing and their burial will happen on 2 separate days. In such a situation, avidut is not deoraita. The Rambam says you have an obligation to put on tefillin even on the day of burial because it's not deoraita. Tefillin is deoraita. So there's a halachic play that's going on over here, a little halachic dance as to figuring out what the levels of each thing are. And in the end of the day, we only exempt a mourner from tefillin if it's the day of passing and the day of burial simultaneously coincide. Otherwise, they do in fact put on tefillin. I'll read to you very briefly from the Torah Ha'adam. Torah Ha'adam is this book right here. It was written by the Rabban, important line about tefillin. Very important line about tefillin. Hopefully you can see it. I know it's a little small in the front. Look at the source 9 on Torah Adam on the left side of the page. You'll see, he says on the second line, V'chen yesh lomar. We can further say that tefillin mishum b'mitzvah rabbah, because tefillin is such a great mitzvah in the eyes of the rabbis. Lo amaru ela yom rishon. Rabbis could only muster up enough strength in the halacha to negate it just on the first day. Sheyesh bo avilut Torah, because that's where mourning is from the Torah. Aval misheni va'elach, from the second day and onward, lo ratzu levatel mitzvah gedolah shel Torah. They did not wish to negate such a powerful and important Torah commandment. Mishum avilut b'divreihem, simply because of a rabbinic command. Because if you think about it, take a step back for a minute. Do we ever have examples where the rabbis undo a mitzvah from the Torah? Can anybody think of an example where the rabbis come in and say, don't do a mitzvah from the Torah? Does such a thing exist? Second day of Yom Tov? Outside of Israel? They're telling you to do an extra mitzvah. What about telling you not to do a mitzvah? Being like when? You always do it. Being overrides everything. Pikuach nefesh, but they're also saving a life. How about Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbat? We don't blow the shofar, right? Why don't we blow the shofar? What are we nervous about? The rabbi said we're nervous, you're going to carry, so don't blow the shofar. But how can the rabbis do that? The Torah says you have to blow the shofar. The rabbis have the power to come along and say, because of a concern that we have, you can't do that mitzvah from the Torah. The rabbis have that power. The rabbis can negate a mitzvah from the Torah if they see fit to protect other concerns that they might have. So you might have said, maybe the rabbi should come along and say, don't do mitzvah tefillin all 7 days. It says that the rabbis themselves realize that we don't have enough power just because of rabbinic mourning to negate the mitzvah of tefillin, which is such an important mitzvah. Shofar they'll negate, tefillin they won't negate. Gives you a sense of how the rabbis thought about the mitzvah of tefillin. Yes,
The rabbis came out and they said conference that's
why do you hate me? Why do you hate me?
isn't that similar thing?
I don't want to get into that. That's a classic trap. On Tish'a list. I don't think that's what they would do. Because everywhere else in the world is the second conference. We have a specific concern here in our community. Yes, there's a concern that we've undermined, but I don't think anybody, including the original rabbis who instituted such a takana, thought that they were undoing the mitzvah from the same level of what the rabbis were doing. The rabbis are telling the entire Jewish world not to blow the shofar on Shabbat of Rosh Hashanah. It takes on a little bit of significance, but you're close. It's close to the league. Carol, you had your hand up.
Oh, no, I was just saying, let's discuss the conflict another time.
Yeah, we're going to do it another time, right? Thank you for supporting me on that.
Also, Rachel, she said a little something weird with class about how even though we shouldn't follow conference, we should still try to accept what they have to offer.
Absolutely, everybody has something to offer, no question about it. So we're getting a sense of how important the mitzvah of tefillin is and how it's interplaying over here with the concept of mourning. So now, I want us to turn our attention to tefillin on Tish'a. So men will be familiar that today, this morning, we did something different. There's a lot of different customs. I'll run through them very, very briefly. A lot of different customs about how people put on tefillin on Tish'a. But it's almost unanimous that everybody does something out of the ordinary when it comes to how they put on their tefillin on Tish'a B'Av, mainly because of this very same fact. We are in mourning. It is a national day of mourning. To put on our tefillin in the regular fashion seems to be inappropriate. It's not befitting the mood, tone, and mindset of the day of Tish'a B'Av. Now, if you take a look at page 4 in the middle of the page, you'll see that the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit says, Kol ha-mitzvot ha-nohagot be'avel nohagot be'Tish'a B'Av. All of the commandments that apply to a mourner apply to Tish'a B'Av, which would seem to suggest that just like a mourner is prohibited from putting on tefillin, it should be perhaps even forbidden for us to put on tefillin on Tish'a B'Av. Maybe we should say that there's no obligation, a complete and total exemption, maybe even prohibition from putting on tefillin on Tish'a B'Av. That being said, if you read the remainder of the Beraita, it says what we're not allowed to do. It says, Asur ba'achila u'b'shtiya, we can't eat or drink, b'sicha, anointing, b'ne'inat sandal, wearing leather shoes, b'tashmish amita, marital relations, Asur b'krot b'torah, you're not allowed to read and study Torah unless it has to do with the topic of mourning, b'nevi'im u'b'ktubim, b'lishnot b'mishnat b'tamut b'neshad ha'chot ha'gadol. So the Beraita lists to us the things we're not allowed to do. What's not on that list? Tefillin is not on that list. So there seems to be a bit of a problem. On the one hand, it says all of the commandments that we do during mourning, we also do during Tish'a B'Av, which would seem to suggest we shouldn't put on tefillin because mourning and Tish'a B'Av are the same. On the other hand, when it tells us what not to do, it doesn't say not to put on tefillin, which might seem to suggest that we have an obligation to put on tefillin. So there seems to be an internal contradiction here within the statement of the Gemara. How do we go about approaching it? So the Rosh over here, I won't read the entire Rosh. Rabbeinu Asher, he says, "B'stavra de'hayav b'tefillin." It makes logical sense that a person would be obligated in tefillin. Although today is a very sad day, we cannot compare the day of national mourning for the Jewish people, although in a broader sense it's a very intense, powerful day. For each and every one of us individually, it does not compare to losing one's own relative. Yes, we're going to talk about what they do, right? First, we're just establishing an obligation, right? So they're more than something. Yes, we're going to see one concept like that as well. But the concept of developing first, how do we know that you're even chayav? How do we know you're even obligated? So the Rosh says, although today is a very intense day of mourning for every one of us on a national level, as individuals, it does not equal a personal loss. A person's own loss is still much more severe and much more intense than the loss of the entire Jewish people. It's not to belittle one, but let's face facts. When a person loses their own relative, that is going to be a much more intense experience than it is for the broader Jewish people. So to compare Tish'a B'Av to the first day of mourning after a person buries their own relative doesn't seem to really match up. Says the Rosh, it makes more sense to compare it at worst to the remaining 6 days of a person's own Avelut, where they would be obligated in tefillin. It seems we also should be obligated in tefillin. And he goes through a long process of proving that that in fact is the case. And if you turn over to the next page, take a look at source 16. Actually, let's look at source 15 for just a moment. That Rabbi at the very end, I highlighted, that Rabbi writes, keep that in the back of your mind. That Rabbi says there are some scholars who have the custom not to put on their head tefillin. Very interesting. So they separate the head and the arm. Not exactly sure why. Maybe by the end of the class we'll have an answer to that. But they separate it. He says there's a custom not to put it on. So we're seeing that there's an interesting evolution. Stay tuned for Joey Moser's class. I'm sure he's going to cover this in lengthy thing. No insights for us. No insights for us. Okay. Chances are he's going to cover something having to do with the tefillin thing. So I don't want to say anything that's wrong. But the Rambam over here does say that there's a custom. There's a custom not to put on their head tefillin. Shulchan Aruch in the next source says that Tish'a B'Av chayavim b'tefillin. First things first, he says on Tish'a B'Av we're obligated to put on tefillin. Cannot simply say we don't put on tefillin today. The question is, how should we do it? Right? So Teta is 100% right. You know the Shulchan Aruch, right? Over here in the next one, right? If you take a look at source 17, in the next one, Shulchan Aruch writes the following. He says, Nohagim shelo le'aniyah tefillin b'Tish'a B'Av shacharit. The custom is not to put on tefillin in the morning of Tish'a B'Av, velo talet, and also not to put on our big talet, Ela lovshin talet katan. They only wear a small tzitzit under our garments. Below beracha, without a blessing. Ubemincha, in the afternoon, manichin tzitzit utfilin u'mbarchim alehem. We put on our tzitzit and our tefillin, and we make berachot upon them. So Shulchan Aruch says the morning when the impact of Tish'a B'Av is the most intense, that's when we don't put on. We wait until the afternoon. Now we're starting to see that the morning period is subsiding a little bit. Some things are changing. We can put on the tefillin in the afternoon. Others have the custom, like the Ben Ish Chai, they put on tefillin in the morning at home, privately, when they come to shul, they pray without the tefillin. Other people do what the Kabbalists do in Yerushalayim, it's reported by Hamukadah. They wear the tefillin regular during the tefillah, but they remove it for the kinot, for the lamentations and fekechas, the sad parts, and they take it off. So we can quibble over what you do, and I do this, and I do that, but that's not my goal here. I just wanted to inform you of it. The key is that everybody does something a little bit different. Everyone's deviating from the normal process of putting on their tefillin because of everything that we've seen to this point, that mourners and tefillin, they don't mix. They don't go hand in hand. Now I want to come to the end, and hopefully this will be the last thing we leave with, is going back to that question of why. We talked about kavanah, but I think there's something even more intense about the nature of tefillin, what tefillin represents, what they're symbolic of, that does not mesh with the concept of mourning. And that, I think, will be hopefully the lesson that I want you to take away over here. If you look at the last page on your sheet, source 20, there's a pasuk in Megillat Echa. First pasuk of the second chapter. It says, Echa ya'iv be'apo Adonai et bat Sion. Alas, the Lord in his wrath has shamed fair Sion. Ishlich mishamayim eretz tiferet Israel. He cast down from the heavens to the earth the glory of the Jewish people. What word did you see there? Tiferet. What has the tefillin been called consistently? He'erva. There was a hint here that the rabbis see. God, almost on his own in here, is telling the people, take off your tefillin. Take off your pe'er. I am casting your glory off of you from the heavens and placing it on the floor. V'lo zachar hadom raglav b'yom ha'po. He did not remember his footstool on his day of wrath. The rabbis look at this pasuk and see something having to do with tefillin. Why is tefillin our glory? What does it represent? And in here, I want to give you the kicker Gemara. It's a Gemara in Masechet Berachot, Vav Amud Aleph. The Gemara says something fascinating about tefillin. Amar Rabbi Avin barav Ada, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Statement in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. Minayin shehakadosh baruch hu maniach tefillin. How do we know that God himself puts on tefillin? And puts on tefillin here we mean metaphorically speaking. God does not have a body. But Rabbi Yitzchak is teaching us a deep idea that Hashem puts on tefillin every morning. What does that mean? And why does he do it? Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Nishba Adonai bimino. God takes an oath with his right hand, ubizroa uzo, and with the strength of his forearm. Biyamino, what does it mean that God takes an oath with his right hand? The rabbis say God's right hand, Zot Torah. That's a hint to the Torah, because the Torah, the pasuk says, Mimino eshdat labo. God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, a fiery religion from his right hand, Mimino. Can anybody think why the right hand specifically? What does the right hand symbolize, as we know? Huh? Strength. Mercy. I want to go with that one. True that our right hand is typically our dominant hand, but the right in Kabbalistic lore also represents compassion. That's the hand you use to extend greeting to somebody, to pull somebody back closer to you. The right hand is compassion and mercy. When Hashem gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he was giving them a book that will teach them to be compassionate and merciful towards the entire world, and to spread that to everybody else. With the strength of his forearm, the rabbis say, is a reference to tefillin. Why do you think Zeroa Uzo is a reference to tefillin? Because where do we put tefillin? We put it on our forearm. That's the place that we put it. Shene'emar Adonai oz na'amo yiten. Hashem gives strength to his people. So just like God gave us the mitzvah to put on tefillin, God himself, metaphorically speaking, fulfills the mitzvah of tefillin. Now, an interesting question is posed by the Gemara. Continuing with this midrash, skip down a couple of lines. They asked the question, actually I'm going to continue. It says, "Uminayin shatfilim ozhem Israel." How do we know that tefillin is our strength? Tichtiv, as the pasuk says, "V'ra'u kol amei haaretz, Hishem Adonai nikra alecha v'yarehu mimeka." All of the nations of the world will see that the name of God is called upon us, and they will be in fear of us. Says the Gemara, the Tanya, the Beretat teaches, this is our head tefillin. The head tefillin represents the name of God. Does anybody know how the head tefillin represents the name of God? You have the shin on the side of it. In the back of it, you have the daled, and then that's two of the three letters, and then on the forearm, there's the little knot by the forearm tefillin, which is the Yud Shaddai, represents the name of Hashem. And certainly the shin of the top of the tefillin, which is on the outside, is visible to everybody. And so says the Gemara, how do we know our tefillin is our strength? It's our pride. It's because all of the nations will see us wearing our tefillin with the name of Hashem on our head, and they will fear us. They will be in awe of us. Two things I want to mention about this. For this reason, there's a halakha that's mentioned not to cover your tefillin shel rosh specifically. Yeah, the person can cover, but their head tefillin should be exposed for others to see, based on this pasuk, because our tefillin shel rosh should be visible to everybody, including the nations of the world, and they will be in awe of us, right? But secondly, now maybe we understand the comment that Rabbi said, that people had the custom of Tish'a BeAb specifically not to put on which of their two tefillin? The tefillin shel rosh, because it is the tefillin shel rosh, more than the yad specifically, that the rabbis are teaching us has an allure to it, because other people see it. It's a source of pride. It's a badge of honor to the rest of the nations of the world. That's where the BeAb comes, but that's where the BeAb comes from. The glory is that Hashem has decided to put His name on our heads, that we get the right to wear it. Not something to be taken for granted. The fact that you can put Hashem's name on your head every single day is an intense idea. We don't get to say the name of Hashem. We get to wear the name of Hashem without Hashem's permission. It's a big undertaking, and that's a prideful thing for us. So to finish up this Gemara, the Gemara asks a fascinating question. What does it say in Hashem's tefillin? In our tefillin, there's parchments that are written inside it. Shema Yisrael, ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, ve'hayayim shamoah tishmeru. Some of our basic, most fundamental values and principles of Judaism are in our tefillin. Well, what's in Hashem's tefillin? Does it say Shema Yisrael in Hashem's tefillin? We seem a bit odd for that to be in Hashem's tefillin. Says the Gemara, you know what's in Hashem's tefillin? Hashem says, Mi ke'amecha Yisrael boi echad ba'aretz. Who is like you, the Jewish people, one nation in the land? In other words, God's tefillin contains what? Praises of the Jewish people. While our tefillin contains what? Praises of Hashem. There is a bond that is created between our physical tefillin and Hashem's metaphorical tefillin, which serve as a consistent reminder in ought that we are Hashem's chosen people. And I would therefore like to suggest that on Tish'a BeAb, why are we not allowed to wear our tefillin? Because God does not wear His tefillin. Because how can God wear the tefillin that says, who are like you, the Jewish people, goy echad ba'aretz? We're in destruction. We're being chastised by God. God cannot praise us on this day because of the consequences He's bestowed upon us. So how can we wear our tefillin the same way we do every single day? When in a sense, Hashem is not wearing His tefillin that honors us on that very same day. The tefillin cannot be worn by a mourner because it becomes incredibly challenging for a mourner to praise Hashem at that time. It is very difficult for him to don his source of pride that he wears out to the rest of the world while his clothes are torn and has ashes on his head, and he or she is in a status of grief and mourning. It doesn't fit for Forget about kavanah and intention. The glory is gone. That aura isn't there. That sense of pride cannot be felt, at least for a short period of time. And hence why we do not go ahead and put on that tefillin. And I think that's a very powerful idea for us to understand that Hashem is also crying and sad on this day. I want to finish up with the Gemara in verse 22. The Gemara says that when a rabbi, his name was Rabbi, took out the book of Lamentations, Echad, and he read that pasuk, Yishlich mishamayim eretz, God cast down Tiferet Israel. The Gemara says the book dropped from his hands. He could not hold the book anymore. He was shaking over reading such a passage. He dropped the book on the floor, and he said these words, Me'ikra ram, from the high roof, to the deep pit. Said Rabbi, this is how the Jewish people live. We are either on the highest of the high or on the lowest of the low. I said this morning in our vignette, so I apologize for repeating it for those who were there. But it's mi'grara, you read on the highest of the roof, or in the deepest pit. Those are the only two places the Jewish people live. When we have the right to put on our tefillin, when we are steadfast in Hashem and the commandments of the Torah, we're on the highest of the highs. Nobody can touch us. We become a model nation to the rest of the world. Everybody's in awe of us. Everybody's scared of us. Everybody's afraid of us. But we're not. We have to remove our tefillin, we go down to the deepest of the pits. There's a story in the Gemara in BeAb about Rabbi ben Zakkai, who was riding on a horse with his students behind him, and in the wake of the destruction, he saw a woman picking barley, I'm sorry for the graphics, picking barley out of the feces of an animal, because that she was starving, she needed to eat, and that's how she could only get her food. And the rabbis looked at her and they said, who's this woman? And Rabbi ben Zakkai recognized her. It was a woman who's the daughter of one of the wealthiest people in the previous generation. He said, when I signed this woman's ketubah, she had enough money to feed 100 Jews for 100 years. That's how wealthy she was. Now she's relegated to picking food out of the dung of an animal. How did we get from here? And Rabbi ben Zakkai says, Ashrehem Israel. How praiseworthy are the Jewish people? The student said, praiseworthy? This is praiseworthy? He said, yes, it's praiseworthy. Ashrehem Israel, because when you do that Sorosh when you do the will of Hashem, you get to be at the top. You get to be like the wealthiest of people. But when you don't, this is where you end up. You end up in the lowest of the low. For Jews, there's no average. There's no mediocrity. There's no in-between. There's no just muddling through. We're either the light unto the nations or we're the laughing stock of everybody. That's the way it works. That's the burden we accepted upon ourselves when Hashem gave us the Torah, is that we live in one of two extremes. And there's no choice between the two. That's what we have to do. I should say there is a choice. The choice is ours, which of those two extremes we want to live in. But there's no in between. And I believe that the concept of tefillin represents that as well. When we put on our tefillin every single morning, we have to think what a prideful mitzvah that I have the opportunity of doing. Well, the opportunity that I get to wear the name of Hashem on my head and on my arm. That I get to walk around with a symbol, with an ot, right? That carries Hashem with me wherever I go. Wives, when you're making the Korat Shabbat for your husbands, you could take part in that part of the mitzvah as well. But certainly women have their other mitzvah. They have their other prideful symbols of what it means to be a member of the Jewish people. Every one of us can find that particular mitzvah, that one that is the ot, the symbol, and say, this is my pride and joy. This is what everyone else is afraid of. This is what everyone else is in awe of. This is where I live at the highest of the high. And so there's a ray of hope. There's a little bit of a sign of tikvah within this message, which is that there is what to look forward to. This morning we read, Betzeti Mitzrayim, Betzeti Yerushalayim. When I left Egypt and when I left Yerushalayim. Why do we read about leaving Egypt? Because we know what it will be. We know the potential that we have. We know that we could live on the highest of highs. If we simply internalize those messages that the tefillin present to us, if we make sure that we live our lives by the code that the Torah has given us, we will certainly experience that high rise. Wonderful. That's good to get it.